It is wonderful to see you here in person despite the COVID pandemic. My name is Daniel Kinderman. I research and teach politics, and it is my great honor and privilege to serve as Director of European Studies here at the University of Delaware. Europe is a fascinating and important part of the world, and here at UD, European Studies has wonderful faculty, classes, and programming, which is why I recommend that students pursue a major or minor in European Studies, of course, for those of you in the audience who are students. A few words of thanks. Today, I'm especially grateful to my colleague, Professor Deborah Steinberger, without whom our speaker, Andrew Curran, did I completely butcher your name? Curran. The William Armstrong Professor of the Humanities at Wesleyan University would not be here. I also want to thank the Office of Institutional Equality, Diversity and Inclusion, the Center for Global and Area Studies, the UD Committee on Anti-Racism, the Department of Languages, Literatures and Cultures, and the Department of English for sponsoring this talk. This talk wouldn't be possible without your generous support. We live in interesting times. Perhaps a terrible mess might be a different way of putting it here. And I'm intrigued, however, by the possibility that your talk, Professor Curran, in addition to being stimulating and exposing us to cutting-edge scholarship and helping us to understand how Europeans in the 1740s understood and conceptualized race, may also contribute in some way to something broader by helping us to hold up a mirror and find some way forward out of this terrible predicament in which we are currently in. And I should have mentioned here, Professor Curran is not only a high-powered scholar, but also a public intellectual, someone who engages not only with other academics, but is very engaged in the public sphere here. So I will stop. Professor Curran, welcome to the University of Delaware. Thank you so much for coming. We look forward to your talk. I will now turn things over to Professor Steinberger.
Thank you, Professor Kinderman. Without you, this would never have happened. Thank you so much for all the trouble you've gone to and all the time you spent in promoting the talk and making it happen. And I'm just going to introduce our speaker. Andrew Curran is an 18th century specialist. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, Time Magazine, Newsweek, the Paris Review, El País, and the Wall Street Journal. He's also the author of 3 books. His most recent book, Diderot and the Art of Thinking Freely, which came out in 2019 from Other Press, was named one of the best biographies of 2019 by El Cultural, Kirkus Reviews, The Australian, the Irish Times, NRC, Open Letters Review, and it's being translated into Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese, and Chinese. His previous book was The Anatomy of Blackness, Science and Slavery in an Era of Enlightenment, which was a choice out. Can you hear me? Should I take my mask off? It's okay?
Feel free.
Okay. Sorry. Which was translated into French as L'Anatomie de la Noirceur. This same book also received the 2018 Louis Marin Prize from the French Académie des Sciences d'Outre-mer. His new book, edited with Henry Louis Gates Jr., is entitled Who is Black and Why? Race, Enlightenment, and Slavery at the Bordeaux Royal Academy of Sciences, and it's forthcoming from Harvard University Press in March 2022. Curran is a fellow in the history of medicine at the New York Academy of Medicine and also a chevalier dans l'Ordre des Palmes Académiques. He has also received grants and fellowships from the French government, the Mellon Foundation, the NEH, and most recently an NEH Public Scholarship. He lives in Connecticut, USA, where he is William Armstrong Professor of the Humanities at Wesleyan University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Curran.
Thank you so much, Deborah, who is a great friend and colleague from NYU. We did our graduate work together. And I want to thank really Daniel Kinderman as well from the English department and a number of people, a number of organizations who contributed to welcome me here today, the Office of Equity and Inclusion, the Center for Global and Area Studies, the Department of Language, Literatures, and Cultures. It is really nice. I came to University of Delaware a few years ago and had a really wonderful time when I was test driving some of the ideas associated with the Diderot project that that Deborah referenced, and it was just such a wonderful time, really great people here. And I quite frankly said, if ever you want me to come back, I'd love to come back and talk to you all. I actually remember some of the faces in the audience here today, which is really great. So yes, I'm going to be talking to you today about this new project, which I'll move this over here. Get a little boom here. Who is Black and Why? And this is a new book. And as you can see, I did this with Henry Louis Gates Jr., who got in touch with me to kind of see if we could actually put something together. He had heard about this contest in my earlier book on race anatomy and said, let's kind of publish the essays that are associated with this whole thing. And it's been a very interesting project, a kind of an archival project, which is actually quite different from the public intellectual type stuff that I'd recently done before. Obviously, Professor Gates, Skip Gates, as they call him, is an incredible public intellectual. I know exactly who I am vis-a-vis this person. But it's been a really interesting time working with somebody like that who is so deeply embedded in contemporary debates. And maybe we can talk about that a little later. He picked out the title, which is an amazing title, and also the Hutchins Center, of which he is the director at Harvard, was associated with an African-American letterpress artist who put together this cover, which is an extremely effective 18th century script. I think it's really great. This came out last week, and I sent it to you guys. I think you were the first people to see it, and I thought I'd show it to you here as well. Now, before I get into this whole discussion about the debate at the Academy with, I kind of alluded to it this afternoon with a bunch of wonderful graduate students here. Before I talk about that, I want to maybe allude to some of the traps that one might fall into when you're kind of talking about this kind of thing. Because we're talking about 16 white men, European men, who are actually writing about blackness in the 18th century. And the obvious question that we ask ourselves is, do we get a distorted view of history when we do something like that? The answer is, of course, yes. Yes. And in fact, what we're doing, though, is studying the distortion. We study the history of race as a concept in order to understand how Europeans and their colonial descendants in North America, Americans later on, and United States citizens, engineered one of the most complete and enduring dehumanizations of a people in history. And by working in this area, I think it's also very important to remember that we're talking not about real Africans, but textualized Africans. These are figments, these are fantasies, these are abstractions, objects of study within a European context, within a discourse inside the discipline known generally as natural history at the time. Now, I bring this up because there are even more traps. And one of the first traps is the fact, of course, in order to talk about the history of race like this, you have to ventriloquize, to a certain extent, some of the structures of oppression, which are still very painful today. And as I said, if you only study this from a European point of view, you have other problems as well. You might give credence to the false idea that Africans were simply objects. They played no active role in controlling their destiny or contributing to what became the Atlantic world, and that's simply not true. And if I were doing a different talk, we could certainly discuss African voices who not only describe their situation, their plight and rebellion, I'm thinking of somebody like Olaudah Equiano, but who actively participated in a counter-discursive, anti-racist dialogue with the European society, refuting much of what I'm going to be talking about today. Now, actually, in my next project, which is also going to be a trade book called The Race Makers, I'll be looking at some of the people who actually produced this, the overall discourse of race during the 18th century, but I'll also be talking about the rebuttal that comes in the 1780s. Today, though, I will be concentrating on this essay contest, which is a bizarre thing that happened in 1739, or was announced in 1739, on the source of black skin and hair that was announced by the Bordeaux Royal Academy of Sciences. This is an institution, if you think about it, that is actually incentivizing, on a certain level, the crystallization of race during the 18th century. Now, as I said, I found these while working on a book that I published in 2011. And in order to understand what is at stake in these essays, we need to talk a little bit about the city of Bordeaux. and its academy. Now, I'm going to first start with the academy here a little bit. A nice slide of the academy. This is the kind of thing which was just so brutal to translate, as you might imagine. Sometimes the writing is on both sides of the paper. Things are lost in the gutters of the pages, which are kind of, you can't pull the manuscript apart. Part of this was not that much fun. Anyway, so here's the Bordeaux Academy. It's been, part of the building is still there today in Bordeaux, and I recommend that anyone who hasn't been to Bordeaux, go to Bordeaux. It's such an interesting city. It's a very 18th century city. It's a city that's full of bâtiments pierre de taille, stone buildings, way more stone buildings than Paris because it was so rich during the 18th century. Most of the buildings in Paris in the 18th century are made out of mortar and wood. Anyway, so the Bordeaux Royal Academy of Sciences is very much like the other provincial scientific academies formed in the 18th century. This academy was formed in 1713. Academies are not universities. We shouldn't confuse them. Universities were in the business of replicating knowledge. And I'm kind of simplifying here, but they're replicating kind of, for example, kind of an Aristotelian understanding of the universe. The institutions were designed not to produce research. They were designed to produce just a new generation of lawyers, new doctors, and priests. They were very static, as I said. And for example, if you think about the University of Paris, the Sorbonne was actually the faculty of theology until the French Revolution. Now, there were about 40 members in the Bordeaux Academy of Sciences. These are elite people who saw themselves as far more enlightened than their counterparts in the university generally. And their stated objective was seeking out scientific truth as part of the larger desire to promote mankind's happiness. So there's a humanist element in here, obviously. And to do so, they proposed essay contests on an annual basis, sometimes twice a year. And they did so generally on physics-related subjects. This is not our notion of physics, but kind of things related to the natural world. It could be, for example, the nature of air, the fluidity of bodies, the formation of kidney stones, and the source of earthquakes. And among these contests, by the 1730s, we start seeing an interest in human physiology, and in particular, non-European physiology or anatomy. And here's where we have to think about the Enlightenment era as not only being anthropocentric, but anthropological or proto-anthropological. And these things, even though you think they're part of the kind of the concept of the human, really sometimes come into conflict. The fascination with with African anatomy becomes explicit, as I said, in 1739. And the Academy announces its contest in the premier scientific journal of the era, the Journal des Savants. The call for papers promised people a cash award, the winner a cash award of the equivalent of 300 livres, which is about an annual salary of a worker at the time. Now the next question is, why Bordeaux? Why not, for example, the Academy of Paris, which is a much bigger and more prestigious? Well, first, obviously, the very identity of the city had been linked with the sea. We know of Bordeaux as a place where wines are made and exported from its kind of excellent strategic position on the Garonne River that goes out the Atlantic. But they were also very much tied to the Caribbean colonies in the, such as Guadeloupe, Martinique, and Saint-Domingue. Saint-Domingue is what we know as of Haiti today. And by mid-century, Bordeaux had the busiest port in France. Much of it came from trade with the Caribbean. Bordeaux's wholesale merchants dispatch shiploads of flour, lard, beef, iron, paving stones, copper, utensils, pottery, roofing materials, wood, hardware, tools, fabrics, textiles, leather, slippers, shoes, and clothing to the islands. And they also supplied the weapons and the ammunition used to control the island's enslaved populations. And in return, and we know this part of the story, they received raw and refined sugar and an enormous assortment of colonial products they dispatched throughout Europe. Obviously, blackness was much more at this time than a simple scientific question. it had become synonymous with slavery itself. And by the 1730s, the members of the Bordeaux Royal Academy of Sciences were very much aware that slavery and blackness and the economy of the city were very much in this big dance at the time. In 1739, there were approximately 30 ships were dedicated full-time to going between Bordeaux and Martinique and Guadeloupe, particularly Martinique, and they went back and forth. Bordeaux was not yet super involved with the triangular trade. They're going back and forth generally at this time. And the great families were very much involved with this, whether they're lawyers, merchants, manufacturers, or vintners. They tended to have numerous contacts with the French islands. Most of Bordeaux's investments, as I kind of hinted before, center on the largest colony, and that is Saint-Domingue or Haiti. And by the end of the 18th century, the majority of the colony's 792 sugar plantations, 3,097 indigo plantations, 2,810 coffee plantations, and 705 coffee plantations, and now the 705 cotton plantations were owned by families who were from Bordeaux. The colony-derived affluence of this relationship with the Caribbean can be seen in the facades and the buildings of Bordeaux today. It added about 5,000 beautiful stone townhouses during the 18th century, and this era was universally recognized as the golden age of Bordeaux for many different reasons. In fact, the beautiful, oops, I've gone too far here. Oh, there we go. So yeah, here's the Port of Bordeaux, and this is one of the slides, one of the images you actually use today, which is a perfect image. This is the Place de la Bourse, which is designed and constructed during the mid-18th century. You can see that the ships came in here, and this is actually the customs house on the left. So the architecture is deeply kind of wrapped up in this colonial enterprise. Let's see. But the most telltale signs of Bordeaux's involvement with the slave trade and the colonies can be seen on the doors of several buildings near the old customs house here. And these are the mascarons. These are mascarons. These are sculpted stone faces with African features kind of stare out in this general area. And they really are a telling reminder that the city's négriers or slave traders were also responsible for transporting 150,000 Africans, captive Africans, to the New World plantations between 1672 and 1837. This figure represents about 12% of the 1.2 enslaved Africans who arrived alive in the French colonies. And to put this in perspective, the city of Bordeaux had 110,000 people living in it in 1789, so they had deported more than their total population toward the end of the century. So now I want to talk a little bit about the essays themselves which came in, and what they can tell us about the history of race. This cache of manuscripts, once you kind of pore over them and go through them, is really like a focus group of sorts in 1741. We talked about this with the graduate students today. This has got a vertical slice of time that has never been kind of explored before in this way. And inside it, we find naturalists, anatomists, climate theorists, theologians, and they were all speculating on the source of African skin and hair at the same time that the slave trade was really taking off in Bordeaux. Coming to grips with what shows up in these essays involves stepping back into time a little bit. We have a lot of conceptions of race and the ideology of various things associated with race. And we have to remember that these essayists lacked both the science of genetics and forensic anthropology, for example. And obviously, these white-centered Europeans would have scoffed at the idea that the Earth's humans can trace their origins to an original group of East African hominids that spread out over the globe approximately 100,000 years ago. In addition to the problems posed by the out of Africa narrative, the timescales, 100,000 years, involved in this theory would have been unimaginable during the 18th century. Even harder to grasp would have been the idea that the world's northern white populations are themselves the descendants of ancient dark-skinned Africans. Whiteness itself is the mutation, the chance result of migration and natural selection for vitamin D-starved bodies. This said, the writers who contributed essays to the Academy contest certainly had their own explanations for the origin of blackness. Indeed, one finds a staggering range of possibilities among these essays. That Adam or Eve was actually black, or Adam was half black. That black is a mark of God denoting sinfulness. That God had made all people white, but some unknown exterior cause generated blackness. Blackness is actually a God-given gift, allowing people to live in the torrid zone. God transmits ethical proclivities to people who then advance these principles toward glory or toward degeneration. A moral defect in parents, a perverse disposition of the mind, leads their progeny to be black. Based on Newtonian optics, blackness results from the absorption of light. Blackness arises from vapors emanating from the skin. Africans have darkened semen. Blackness results from the blood, and blacks have darker blood because of the effect of air. There's a specific liquid in the black body. This hereditary feature is passed down through the soul of the father, who impresses this blackness on the mother. White skin has a greater number of tubes filled with transparent liquid near the surface of the skin, whereas blacks have far thicker blood that cannot nourish the tubes, and thus they have drier, darker skin. And finally, if certain geographical locations produce certain traits, for example, red hair in England, then it follows that the African region produces blackness. And there's obviously a battle going on here among these different causal explanations. And in total, there are 16 of them, as I said. 8 were written in Latin, 8 were written in French. A number, as you can probably guess, were written by ecclesiastics or devout lay people. And it's really interesting that for these religiously oriented essayists, for these religious-oriented essayists, the reasons for participating in this ostensibly natural history competition had little to do with determining the source of black skin and black hair. The real goal was putting forward a theory of human difference that was compatible with scriptural authority. Religious-oriented contributors often attempted to give credence to 3 truths related to the creation story. And the first, as you can see here, is a biblical chronology. The idea, which is based on a literal reading of the Bible, that God had created the earth precisely 5,741 years before the 1741 contests. This is the Royal Almanac here, and notice the chronology. The 4,000 years between the creation and the birth of Jesus Christ. It's 4,085 years since the flood, 1,741 years since the birth of Christ, et cetera, et cetera. This was published for Louis XIV initially, and then all throughout the 18th century. Now, as important as this biblical time scale was the status of nature itself. For the most literalist of biblical scholars, nature had no autonomous history. It was static, it was fixed, it was providentialist, guaranteed by God's order. It was a category dependent entirely on divine will. And the third and most important concept related to Christian anthropology, as I like to call it, was the idea that, according to Scripture, all the world's peoples were not only created by God, but were God's children, members of the larger family of humankind, the descendants of God's 3 sons. And here's a slide here, which is going to, which represents the great myth of Ham. I'm not going to go too deeply into the kind of biblical exegesis that is attached to this notion, but suffice it to say here that Noah had 3 sons when he lands in the ark. His 3 sons kind of go off and, they're fruitful and multiply across the earth. We have one problem in the story, and this is Ham, who's pictured in darkness here. He looks at his father Noah, who had been drinking and was naked, and this is earned him the curse, the so-called curse of Canaan, who is his son, to become a servant of servants. Now, a couple of the essays kind of took up this idea as an explanation for blackness. And this was based on, they put forward these Byzantine interpretations of the parable, asserting that Ham's grandson Cush went on to populate Ethiopia, and that these so-called Hamites were not only destined to be slaves, but had become darkened in the process. And this notion is not in the Bible at all, but it comes from a 3rd century biblical exegesis, both among Jewish scholars and Christian scholars in North Africa. There were other essayists as well who tended to go in an opposite direction and emphasize the positive proto-biological notions associated with this idea that was embedded in this parable. So on the one hand, you have the idea that blackness denotes sinfulness and a particular kind of causality. Also part of this parable, there's the idea that the Bible states without a doubt that humankind shared one origin and that people had all come to a so-called one father. And this is a theory known as monogenesis, the idea that there's one genesis of the human species. And this monogenetic idea brings us to the precise language that the Bordeaux Academy members came up with for the contest, which was, what is the source of the degeneration of black hair and black skin? And this is really the key to the contest on race, as we call it, at the Bordeaux Academy. Human degeneration was a critical concept for the 18th century. And today, the term degenerate conjures up someone who has, quote, lost the physical, mental, or moral qualities considered normal and desirable, often associated with criminality. Now, the same basic concept is found on the level of the human species in the Academy's question. In asking contestants to identify the causes of African degeneration, the Bordeaux Academy was asserting that black humans were somehow debased and corrupted, albeit members of the human species. Now, describing an entire branch of the human species is obviously appalling. And yet it's interesting to note that the Academy's reliance on the concept of degeneration was actually designed to create a firewall between their competition and an even more dreadful notion than degeneration, and that is polygenesis. This was the notion that the most extreme examples of humans, Africans and Laplanders, were actually distinct species of humans who had come into existence separately and independently from whites. The belief that a distinct human group had separate origins had been already advanced before this time by a small and marginal group of radical biblical thinkers as early as the 16th century. And like other proto-anthropological ideas dating from the early modern era, polygenist theory was first discussed in the context of religious debates as early as 1520. And in particular, in relation to the discovery of a new type of humans, Native Americans, who had not been accounted for in the Bible. The members of the Bordeaux Academy were relating not to 16th century ideas, but much more so to the 17th century French theologian Isaac de la Pereire, who was actually from Bordeaux. In 1655, Pereire claimed that before God created the Jews, he had given life to the tribes of Gentiles. And by Gentiles, he meant Native Americans, Eskimos, Africans, South Sea Islanders, Chinese, and even Europeans, all of whom initially lived in something akin to Hobbes' state of nature. Two of the Bordeaux essayists picked up on this idea. They mentioned either black Adams or pre-Adamite peoples. And this form of polygenesis was still somewhat benign and apolitical. It wasn't really attached to an ideology of race. As I said, it was deeply attached to these kind of religious debates. But later on, various forms of polygenesis were harnessed by both anti-clerical thinkers and pro-slavery thinkers to justify certain concepts and ideas. And I'll get back to that in a second. Now, we've talked a little bit about some of the kind of religious context and religious essays. I want to now touch on several essays that show what we might call a rising classificatory impulse, a new naturalistic tendency to categorize humans that is much more directly to the birth of race. Essayist number 15 was fascinated by the possibility of a naturalist scientific classification of Africans. And for him, he looks back to the ideas of François Bernier, who wrote a book called A New Division of the Human Species, or actually an article in 1684. This was 60 years before the contest. And Bernier maintained that humankind could be organized into fixed, distinct, racialized categories. In fact, he said humans could be divided into either races or species. There's some ambiguity whether you're saying espèce, species, or type. But he was really one of the first people, or the first person, to use race in kind of a zoological context, as opposed to talking about lineage of kings, for example. Now, Bernier was not a polygenist per se, but he certainly encouraged people to think of human beings as composed of fundamentally different races or species. And this was particularly appealing, as I hinted about a second ago, by appealing to anti-clerical thinkers. For example, Voltaire, who would do anything possible to lambaste the church. He used polygenesis against the Bible, against metaphysics, about the idea of a shared human, the human story coming from the Old Testament. Voltaire went way beyond Bernier. He claimed that the anatomy and intelligence of Ethiopians, as he called them, differed so much from those of whites that it was clear that blacks were members of an entirely distinct species with different origins. He writes, "It seems to me that my belief that there are different kinds of men, just as there are different kinds of trees, is well-founded. Pear trees, fir trees, oak trees, and apricot trees do not at all come from the same kind of tree, and the bearded whites, the wool-bearing Africans, the horse-haired yellows, and the beardless men do not originally come from the same species of man." This is early, in the 1730s. This won't even be picked up on by many people for another 40 years. He's seen as actually rearguard vis-a-vis the evolution of natural history in the 18th century, but in fact he's very much in the avant-garde if we look at the way race evolves later on in the century. Now the Academy had bylaws. It said they could absolutely not entertain any idea that went against religion, even though they saw themselves as a scientific academy. They did not want to encourage polygenesis. By forcing their essayists to explain how the degeneration of black skin and hair came about, they were predetermining the kind of essay that would win the contest. And this is an essay that implicitly respected a biblical understanding of humankind, even if it didn't mention it, but that would also presumably provide a naturalistic explanation of how an original group of white people were related to the supposedly degenerate Africans. Most of the essayists who attempted to explain black skin and hair understood perfectly what the Academy wanted. This was especially true of the partisans of climate theory and humoral theory, and also new anatomical discoveries. Now, among these naturalist explanations, there's obviously metaphysical, divine, religious explanations, and naturalistic, physical, attached to the physical world. Among these naturalist explanations, climate was by far the most popular explanation for African pigmentation and even morality in 1741. And this is obviously not a new concept at the time. As early as 400 BCE, Hippocrates had written a climatological-based treatise entitled Airs, Waters, and Places that posited a causal relationship between extreme environments and the minds and bodies of peoples living under such conditions. Bioclimatic theory was an appealing choice, certainly, for many of the Bordeaux essayists, for a couple of reasons. First of all, it rendered the story of Noah's children slightly more scientific, because one could posit that Noah's children spread out over the earth and were fruitful and multiplied, as I said. And climate theory also allowed the era's naturalists to identify the temperate European climate as a source of white cognitive, aesthetic, and ethical superiority. Essayist number 2 put this very bluntly. It is only in the intermediate regions, especially the warmer ones, that we find fertility and agile minds, an agreeable activity in external manners, and a delicate sensibility in pleasures. 7 years later, Montesquieu will kind of do the exact same thing in the spirit of the laws. And in these kind of theories, we see that the environment is not only determining the type of people who inhabit a certain land, but that the temperate European region positioned whiteness as humankind's primary and best color. Climate theory also became an effective tool among a new group of secularly minded thinkers, many of whom were envisioning a far more fluid understanding of human history than had been the case in the past. And this explains the existence of several very surprising essays that we find in this collection. Essayist number 4, for example, maintained that African traits were only temporary accidents brought on by African food, drink, climate, and customs. Essayist number 8 actually proposed himself as a living example of racial reversibility. He explained that one of his ancestors was black and that his own pigmentation now showed no traces of this coloring. He claimed that Ethiopians who moved to colder climates would, over several generations, not only lose their blackness, but all African traits. And it's interesting to see that similar statements were also made about the potential mutability of white populations in some of these essays. The idea went as follows. If you transported a family of Englishmen to the Congo, in 120 years or so, their descendants will have degenerated and have become black. And the same went in the other direction. If you took people from the Congo and took them to England in 120 years, they too would become white, like the people around them. This possibility of racial reversibility is very epistemologically kind of significant and quite interesting. It's indicative of the notion that nature was becoming far more dynamic. And by dynamic, I mean that it can change and move. It also contradicted the implicit fixism of creationism. And there is at this time in the 1740s in France, much more so than anywhere else on the continent, a new generation of thinkers who were asserting that natural forces acting on matter could produce accidents, including human accidents that were clearly outside of God's jurisdiction. Now, the belief in human mutability that appears briefly in some of these Bordeaux essays was gaining traction, as I just said, in the 1740s. In 1749, Juge Georges Louis de Clercq, Comte de Buffon, picked up where many of these Bordeaux contestants had left off, and he synthesized many of these climatological notions into a dynamic and degenerative chronicle of the human species in his Histoire naturelle, or natural history. You have to, Buffon, we've kind of forgotten about who he is, but he's really the most significant kind of naturalist in between Aristotle and Darwin. He really kind of changed the world in many ways. In fact, he was one of Darwin's favorites. So in the 1749, he wrote a section of his book called the Varieties of the Human Species. And you'll notice he used the term varieties and not races. And he writes in this about degeneration that as soon as mankind began to move around the world and spread from climate to climate, its nature was subject to various alterations. These changes were minimal in temperate regions, lands that we presume to be the place of its origin, but these changes increased as man moved farther and farther away, and once centuries had passed, continents had been crossed, offspring had degeneration due to the influence of different lands, and many people had decided to settle in extreme climates and populate the desert sands of southern lands and the frozen regions of the north. These changes became so significant and so apparent that it would have been understandable to believe that the Negro, the Laplander, and the white constituted different species. And so he's saying polygenesis might exist. But these markings are in no way original or distinct. These natural alterations, these differences, being only in the exterior, are only superficial. It is in fact certain that all humans are nothing more than the same man who has been adorned with black in the torrid zone and who has been tanned and shriveled by the glacial cold at the Earth's pole. We could talk about Buffon for 4 hours. He's so interesting, and the contradictions that are embedded in this narrative are really amazing. Indeed, this idea cuts 2 different ways. On the one hand, Buffon was forcefully asserting that differences among the different world's peoples are only skin deep. And on the other hand, obviously, his version of the human story suggested both the ancestral and qualitative supremacy of a white prototype race, a race that, having multiplied and spread across the surface of the globe, in time produced all of humankind's varieties. It's interesting to juxtapose Buffon also with Linnaeus, who publishes his Systema Naturae in 1735, which is the first real classification of the human species in a kind of taxonomical kind of way. Buffon and Linnaeus hated each other. In fact, Linnaeus named a plant Buffonia because it smelled absolutely terrible. Anyway, so what's interesting about this, as I said, it cuts both ways. And Buffon is processing the era's ethnographic prejudices and data into a coherent proto-racial chronicle of the human species. Now, as I have said, explaining the source and the meaning of blackness during the 18th century from a scientific point of view occupied three distinct types of thinkers, all mutually influencing. There were the traditional natural historians interested in describing nature, including humankind's varieties, and Buffon is kind of part of this group. There were also taxonomists like Linnaeus and Bernier, who broke the species down into conceptual categories based on morphological or ostensibly kind of essential traits. And finally, there were anatomists who sought out clues of an essential blackness within the cadavers they dissected. This tendency, the anatomical understanding of the African, is also present in the 1741 contest. The last essay in the contest was a 14-page submission sent in by a guy by the name of Pierre Barrère, who was a Perpignan anatomist. And these were all anonymous essays, but I realized that he had published this in Paris later on and traced it back to the archive. Unlike most of the other contestants, Barrère had actually studied black anatomy in his capacity as a surgeon and a botanist on a plantation in French Guiana. In fact, Barrère claimed to have found the secret to blackness while dissecting cadavers on this plantation. And this is, again, an example of the fantastical and phantasmagorical science. One of many examples I have seen during the 18th century, during my study of this kind of stuff during the 18th century. And there's a very funny phenomenon with anatomists who look to find certain anatomical structures in black bodies always find them, even though the structures didn't exist and they're completely imagined. In the published version of his book, which was called the Dissertation on the Physical Cause of the Color of Negroes, Barrère announced to the world that he had discovered Africans' bile was as dark as ink and their blood was a reddish black. This, too, is a kind of much more scientific version of what we see in kind of Hippocrates' humoral theory, and Galen as well. Blackness, as Barrère described it, was a far more than the simple effect of the sun burning the skin. It was a pathological, jaundice-like problem within the African body that was caused by an excess of a black substance in the blood that was comparable to bile. It was due to the inner workings and constitution of the African body itself. So this is an interesting moment where we see the idea of race moving from the outside of the body to the inside of the body, to both internal structures and hereditary structures. Now, despite the incredibly spurious and bad science that's associated with Barrère's work, his claims echoed in European thought for decades. He's completely forgotten now, but he was super important for a number of people, all the way up to Kant and Blumenbach. In many ways, even though there was no winner for this contest, and we'll probably talk about that in a bit, Barrère won it in many ways. He became quite well known. In fact, Buffon, who pored over Barrère's essay while writing the natural history, recognized the validity of the discovery, although he wanted to downplay it because he wanted to emphasize the overall kind of palette of human colors and didn't like essentialized ideas. Other people who read about Barrère were far more intrigued by his views of African anatomy. And by the 1750s, a number of anatomists followed Barrère's lead and began seeking out deeper, supposedly organ-related structures of Africanness. In 1755, the German anatomist Johann Friedrich Meckel announced that his dissection of an African man had revealed that Africans had bluish brains and darkened pineal glands. 10 years later, in France, Claude Nicolas Le Cat, which is spelled like cat, who was a French anatomist working in Rouen, claimed that his own dissection studies had allowed him to identify an elemental black fluid, which he called ethiops, that supposedly coursed through the veins of Africans' bodies. He also said that sperm was affected by this as well. These were presented as breakthroughs, which were generally received as fact and provided a new generation of European classifiers, particularly the Germans, with the raw material for an increasingly essentialized or racialized category for Africans. Take, for example, the father of physical anthropology, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, who looked back to this precise data and cited the so-called Ethiopian's dry and heavy body, an ash-colored brain, and dark spinal marrow as part of his classification of the human species into 4 categories in his 1775 On the Natural Varieties of Mankind. Interesting because Blumenbach is actually an apologist for the African in other contexts and a very firm abolitionist. Now, it would be a stretch to say that the Bordeaux Royal Academy of Sciences brought about the racialization of the black African during the 18th century. Indeed, the only person of note who, there's Barrère, sorry about that. The only person of note who alluded to this competition in subsequent years was Voltaire. And he did so in order to mock it as a perfect example of the intellectual bankruptcy of this type of contest. And this must have really ticked off the Academy for 2 reasons. First, because Voltaire was actually a corresponding member of the Bordeaux Academy. And even worse, he inserted his satirical presentation of this contest on blackness in the most famous short story of the 18th century, which is Candide. The scene in question takes place when Candide, who is traveling with an enormous red sheep that he had acquired in the utopian country of El Dorado, arrives in Bordeaux on his way to Paris. And while in Bordeaux, Candide realizes that he can no longer take care of his exotic pet and donates the animal to the Bordeaux Academy of Sciences. The Academy, according to Bordeaux's story, saw the sheep's unusual color as an excuse for yet another excellent contest and quickly proposed a prize competition for that year on the subject of why the wool of the sheep was red. And unlike what happened in the actual Bordeaux contest of 1741, in Voltaire's story, the Bordeaux Academy actually awarded a prize to a man whom the narrator jeeringly describes as, quote, a scholar from the north who demonstrated by A plus B minus C divided by Z that the sheep had to be red and would die of the mange. Voltaire's humorous jab notwithstanding, the Bordeaux Academy's long-lost competition on African skin color remains a telling example of a critically significant moment in proto-anthropology. Well, Voltaire was in fact very much correct that such a contest would ultimately teach Europeans very little about the actual riddle of blackness. He failed to understand that the Academy had actually managed to bring about a new era, an era in which science would claim the right to provide compelling anatomy-based explanations for humankind's many varieties. And these new methods and discoveries would, of course, ultimately have another function as well, vindicating the ongoing dehumanization of people of color in the Americas. Thank you. Deborah, do you want to make an announcement about? Yes. I gather if there happens to be anybody who's watching this on the live stream and would like to ask a question, they should send it to Stein D at udel.edu. So,
interested to know if there's any discussion of, in the discussion of race is taking place, races in isolation from each other, because so much, certainly later anthropological discussion of race talks about what are the possibilities of two races coming together and then reproducing among themselves. Métissage or misogynation, as it gets written about in English. And I mean, the reason I'm curious as to whether this issue came up in any of the essays at all is just because, you know, you alluded to the French colonies in the Caribbean, where of course there are what they call gens d'honneur. There are many people, some of them even slave owners themselves, once who were freed. And it's such a complex world over there, and yet the essays you're describing are so productive and make, to use the word you used, static. And yet you talk about one who was in French Guiana. So I'm always really puzzled by this. How do any of these theories stand up to actual human observation?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So it's a question of misogynation and how that's seen by these people. What's, I think, very important when we consider the group of people who send in essays, they tended not to be writing from Liverpool or from Nantes. They tended to be from kind of more remote areas. There was somebody writing from Ireland, there was someone writing from Sweden, and so they really had little contact with actual Africans. I think the people from Bordeaux are far more aware of misogynation because that was the reality in the colonies more and more. Even though race mixing was theoretically prescribed by the Code Noir in 1685, it was rampant. In fact, it was encouraged in certain kind of contexts. And so there was a more and more kind of a basic kind of biological kind of reality check that was happening, certainly in the 18th century. And there were people like, people kind of worked against this, like Maurice de Saint-Méry at the end of the 18th century, who tried to come up with a classification scheme that took into consideration all of these things, which is actually kind of reminiscent of kind of casta paintings from the Spanish context, where you kind of look at the potential breakdown of these things. So even though there was a whole palette of possibilities, there is a tendency in 18th century, 19th century thought, 17th century thought, to kind of come up with some kind of make kind of order out of those things as well. Sometimes categories kind of worked in a different way. So Kant later on will look at the fact that there is a white category and a black category, and the fact when they come together and they produce a new category as proof of fact of the first two categories. It's kind of the first opportunity to prove the existence of these two categories from a philosophical point of view, curiously enough, and make order out of the kind of the muddy concept of degeneration. For him, degeneration actually proves in a way that these original categories were original. So it is seen, the question of human hybridization is seen in a lot of different ways. Certainly Buffon was much more sophisticated in that. He understood that there was a lot of, just a huge palette of colors, whereas Linnaeus associated color with continent. You know, African is Niger, and then Asiaticus Fucus, he would actually associate color and continent, whereas the non-classificatory impulse was to actually recognize the full kind of spectrum of possibilities.
In your remark to Owen, you mentioned someone from Ireland, someone from Sweden, but I may have missed it, but in the talk, you didn't really talk about the geographical distribution of the contributors. And I guess that's a question, and with that in mind, what's missing in this collection? What intellectual centers are missing? What prevailing ideas of the emerging Enlightenment are missing? Is Protestant religious? Is Protestant thought different from the Church's thought that was represented here? Questions are raised.
Yeah, I wish I knew more about the full geographic distribution because the essays came in anonymously, and what would happen is to attach them to the actual author, they put an aphorism at the bottom of the essay, and they would send in a separate envelope with a matching aphorism and their address. And so through kind of crazy kind of tracing of things, I've nailed down about 4 or 5 people, but not all of them. So there's this Irishman who is Catholic, and there's the Lutheran Swede But we don't have a great representation of different things, and many of the people writing from abroad seem to be more interested much more in theology than kind of scientific type ideas. What we do see looking around is that people heard about this all over the place. There's a Virginia physician who wrote somebody at the Royal Academy in London about this. People were talking about this a lot, and they actually kind of generated their own theories. The little blurb before the introduction, I found a thing where this guy was saying, I've came up with my own theory, but it's too late for the Bordeaux contest. And he wrote that in 1743. So the Protestant question is really interesting, and thinking about comparative slavery, comparative kind of epistemology, comparative kind of understandings of humankind is super important, comparative kind of proto-anthropology, because Protestants saw Africans in a very different way because of primarily because religious type orientation. Catholics, Spanish, Portuguese, and French felt that Africans were giving up their physical freedom but were getting eternal salvation, whereas particularly early on in the English world, the notion was that Christians don't enslave fellow Christians. So they didn't want Africans to be Christianized. So that's two very kind of important different distinctions that also explain slave codes in the French Caribbean and the Caribbean as well, whereas the Barbados Code and the Jamaican Code were really about human chattel on a lot of levels. When Louis XIV gets into this whole question, he's going to be putting forward something that's deeply embedded in his kind of Christian ideology and the idea of him being the kind of the new Christian pope on a certain level in the Caribbean. So I wish I had a better distribution of those things. Some of the essays I just figure they're from France because they're written in French. I don't know where some of the Latin ones came from, and some of the kind of crappy 18th century Latin doesn't really let me figure it out really. And even the professional translators who went over it weren't able to say this seems like this person came from Jesuits or something like that. It was very hard to determine. So you've picked up on kind of one of the weak links in this overall presentation. I do feel like it's kind of it's a vertical slice, but I wish I had more information. I felt frustrated, maybe like you did too. So.
I was just curious as to what, if any role gender plays in this whole discussion. Does anyone talk about that? I mean, certainly, women, gender, that's sort of these pseudo-scientific attempts to classify that, tends to be femininity, female sex tends to kind of come in as the imperfect, the defective male, and I know that in Italy in the 17th century there were satirical treatises circulating that argued that women were not actually the same species as men, so part of it, satirical, but part of that sort of pseudo-scientific attempt to make distinctions between ideas about species and equivalency and origin. So does gender come into that?
Well, not too much here, but it's an excellent question to think about the fact that the kind of definition of sex as a biological concept is happening at the same time. There's a great book by Elsa Dorlin called La Matrice la Race, the womb of race. The fact these two things are definitely related at the same time. It's the kind of the question of homosexuality, and all of the kind of the classificatory impulse in the 18th century is defining all sorts of categories, gender, human sexuality, and so on and so forth as well. And the kind of biologicalization of sex taking place in the 18th century is happening at the same time. The only time that gender plays a role here is when people are talking about hypersexuality of Africans in that context. So it's kind of an ethnographic kind of detail that's kind of thrown out by one of the more kind of racist contributors. But nobody was sophisticated enough to problematize those two things at the same time in these essays. And yet it is clearly something that's super important, particularly in the decades to follow as well. The contest after this one, when they took the money and tripled the money for the next contest, was how to prevent wet nurses from ruining children in Paris or something like that. So they're actually kind of moving toward questions of gender right after they dealt with race. It's an interesting kind of transition.
So So how did Europeans at this time approach races, I suppose, that weren't necessarily too different than the white race, for example? So what I mean is that you're basing it on blackness, but what about races that aren't defined by dark pigments of skin necessarily? Well, to an extent, like East Asians or Middle Easterners or Native Americans. How did they approach that?
Yeah, so it's not an easy answer because obviously things evolve very quickly. During, if you think about this slave trading port, their obsession was kind of that thing. Certainly people were traveling to Asia. Asia was seen also as a possible kind of enlightened land and a competitor, China in particular and Japan, to Europe in many ways. Ancient civilizations like the Egyptians, the Chinese were kind of seen in the same way. So there wasn't a kind of a racialized commentary based on the notion of civilization or lack thereof. This said, what happens after, as a matter of fact, in 1684, when that Bernier guy who actually goes to India, he creates the first category of people, and it says it includes Europeans, North Africans, Jews, people in the Arabian Peninsula, and a lot of Asians all the way through, and pretty much all of India, and then Asians all the way through to Thailand. So he says this is the first group of people, and then there's Laplanders, Africans, and so the conception of this first group was huge, and it wasn't based on whiteness. In fact, he said Asians are white, and this first group has lots of different colors, which is very interesting when you think about it. Later on, of course, that breaks down, and the kind of the methodology of talking about Africans is then generalized to every different group. And so you start seeing this like in 1758 in Linnaeus. Linnaeus, we think of the kind of the father of classification in a lot of ways, and his Systema Naturae is all of kind of natural phenomena. Everything in the three kingdoms. And so what he does with humans is he breaks them down and he associates them with particular traits. And then that's the first time we really get a zoological portrayal of humankind from 35 to 58. And that's the time, 1758, where things really kind of take off. People say, I can quantify the liabilities of certain groups and their temperament and their, the problems with in their bodies. He thought that each one kind of had a liability, except for Europeans, whom he described as sanguine, or the people who are melancholic or essentially colicky in many views. He used these humoral kind of ideas to reduce people to particular tendencies, different groups.
So would you say that the reason there was such a focus on Black Africans was would you say that it was because Europeans wanted to morally justify the slave trade?
That is yes, but initially there was no need for a justification, right? So that's the thing that's terrifying about this. The enslavement of Africans was seen as kind of a natural kind of phenomenon, and later on the justification, all the kind of the prejudices that go along with it are used to kind of justify it. The initial justification, particularly in Catholic countries, was eternal salvation. They said that's a great deal, essentially, they were saying. So that's the kind of the irony of the whole thing. That justification would change as a function of the overall political climate.
We have a remote question.
Oh, wow.
Yes. To get a Nagitsbani Rob, Professor Emerita. Voltaire and Candide also criticized cruel treatment of slaves. Professor Curran also mentioned an essayist who later was an abolitionist. Could he comment further on that writer or any abolitionist ideas expressed in the essay?
Sure. Oh, not in these essays, but certainly the Voltaire question is important. Like very many Enlightenment thinkers. Yes, I'm sorry, that's a mistake. Yeah, sure. So Professor Rob is asking two questions. First, to kind of comment on Voltaire, the fact that I talked about one aspect of Voltaire here in Candide, but not the indictment of slavery, which is actually part of his worldview. And that's, I think, an important question. It's important to kind of not give both sides, but to give a complete picture. Here, I was really talking about the essays here, and it's absolutely true that Voltaire is one of the number of thinkers towards 1759, so it's later, who are actually talking about the problems involved with the slave trade and the cruelty. This said, Voltaire's overall kind of biological understanding of the African is racist. And I use that term very rarely because he is deploying an ideology of race. Determinism, heredity, difference, and also there's a kind of an idea in the Essay on Nations, Essay sur les mœurs, which is actually very much tied to not the justification of slavery, but the fact that it is understood. It's very much like Montesquieu as well. Montesquieu is seen as the father of anti-slavery, but he's also somebody who puts forward a vision of environmental theory, which almost kind of justifies the idea that you could understand that slavery would be better in certain countries. So his environmental relativism actually extends to kind of different political systems, and that's obviously the basis of Spirit of the Laws. Now, Professor Robb also asks about questions related to the dissonant voices. Who's writing against this stuff? And I alluded to early on, I mean, there are a number of people who are writing against slavery. The most important kind of group of people in France are the physiocrats initially, who are saying this doesn't make any sense economically, and then the philosophers. And that genealogy does begin with Montesquieu in 48, where he really satirizes the reasons that justify slavery, both biological and economic, and also moral. And then that moves into the later encyclopedia, and then particularly this book called The History of the Two Indies by Abbé Raynal. And The History of the Two Indies is the first kind of philosophical interrogation of colonization by Europeans. Diderot wrote about a quarter of it, and they really lambast slavery, particularly in the later editions in that. And that really kind of launched a lot of got a lot of people interested, including in the United States, because these books were going back and forth. I mean, Diderot was talking to Ben Franklin via Raynal without really knowing it. And so there was a huge kind of correspondence going between Philadelphia. And obviously we have to, I talked about Ole de Equiano, who is the first African to write an autobiography that is truly a kind of abolitionist. He talks about his life in Nigeria and how he goes to Virginia, and then just the kind of the travails of his own life. And this is all part of a demonstration that these racial ideas really do not obtain to him and are false, right? So he's writing these things. And the idea of writing refutes the idea that these people didn't have a reason, the ability to do these kind of higher arts. So Phyllis Wheatley as well. So there's a lot of examples of people kind of demonstrating their capacities against a lot of the ideas that were percolating in these essays as well. I'm not sure I did to the whole thing there, but those two questions, yeah.
Another question, unless there's something else. So you said there was no winner in the contest?
Yeah.
Do you know anything about how the prize committee is,
Well, there was a very bad secretary who, I found the sheet where they were taking notes during the meeting, and he's either drunk or kind of falling asleep because I couldn't read a thing. The super high-level kind of person who can kind of read any manuscript said this is just illegible. It doesn't make any sense. And this was the meeting where they kind of did, and he's notorious for this. This guy just did terrible, terrible notes. The next secretary was wonderful. But in the, I think, the Journal des Savants, or was the Mercure Galon still around at that time? I think they published the Mercure saying that they got together and they didn't like any of the essays. It's quite ambiguous. But Barrère said, he was encouraged to publish his, which is interesting, that maybe some of them really did like his essay. So we don't know too much about that, but I mean, certainly they don't want to publish anything that is kind of has polygenic smell to it. And some of the other things don't. I should say there's a second contest that I'm publishing with this book, which was in 1772, and you can see how things are changing. At this point, as I said, the people are getting nervous about the slave trade, and the Bordeaux Academy says, let's do a different kind of contest. And this contest will be, how do we resolve, or how do we make the Middle Passage better, essentially, less deadly to Africans? And clearly, this is an example of enlightened slavery, the idea they're using Enlightenment ideas of progress and reason and humanity to, in fact, increase profits for the people of Bordeaux. They only got 3 submissions, but they're very fascinating too. So the idea of these prize problems, as they call them, is really very, very curious, particularly as they relate to kind of New World problems.
Did anyone associated with the Academy or this contest have a direct financial or economic interest in the slave trade itself? I'm wondering about you've addressed throughout your talk the sort of political economy side of things, and many of the questions from the audience also related to that. I'm wondering what's going on around this that could be also motivating people in certain ways.
Yeah, so who is the Bordeaux Academy? In a short talk, I didn't really get into that, but as I traced the families, I traced what they did, and the Bordeaux Academy is about a little bit more than half elite nobles. Like Montesquieu is a member of the Academy, and these people are magistrates, lawyers, and they're landowners because they have huge. They have the one business that the nobles would get into was wine, right? So they had huge properties, etc. Some of the families who didn't have as much money would marry into bourgeois families who are incredibly rich, from Saint-Domingue. And so there's some kind of stuff going on there for sure. Or they had brothers or sisters, other families. So people started becoming more and more associated, and the idea of the nobility or the aristocracy was one thing. The other half of the academy were people who actually had expertise. They're at a lower level. They're membres ordinaires and then membres associés. So the associated members might be like actual scientists or have some scientific background, but the elite members are the ones that actually decided everything. And as I said, most of them were in the parliament, magistrates in the parliament. And the parliament in France is also this kind of these regional powers all around the country. And the Bordeaux parliament would, like any other parliament, ratify the edicts coming from Versailles, and they would ratify those things. So it's not quite kind of division of powers, but on a certain level it is. They acted as a supreme court in Bordeaux. And what's interesting is that they would actually vote on things related to the slave trade sometimes. So there's a couple pieces of legislation having to do with who can be in France. And we talked about Sue Peabody's work today. So Sue Peabody is a wonderful legal historian who worked on who was allowed to, what was the status of Africans in France. Theoretically, according to the free soil principle, they would be free when they stepped foot on France, but they kind of played with that so that would no longer be the case in 1716 and 1738. So the Bordeaux Parliament votes on that. 12 members of the Academy are in the Parliament voting for slavery in 1738. So that's the first part of my answer. The second part is something I found in the archives, which I found to be absolutely amazing. There's I forget, it was in the 1730s at some point. They decided that when they had a contest that did not resolve or was canceled or whatever, they would buy shares in the Compagnie des Indes. So a trading company. So a trading company involved very much in the slave trade. So there's a precise thing. These people are very much involved with what's going on in the Caribbean. It was hard to kind of track exact families too much, but I did find, 10 or 15 people who are directly involved as well. Brother is a banker here, involved here. Somebody got some land in Martinique. Anything from my friends, the graduate students?
That
may be it.
Well, if there are no more questions, thank you all for coming. And thank you, Dr. Kern.
Thank you so much. It was really, really fun.